Good morning. Today I'm going to talk about Hebbian learning and Hopfield networks. These are early ideas about how neurons learn. These are these are old and outdated ideas about how neurons learn. We have much more advanced models than these, but the basic ideas behind Hebbian learning and Hopfield networks are still relevant for neuroscience and artificial intelligence today. So, what is Hebbian learning? Hebbian learning, Donald Hebb was a person, he was a scientist. So Hebbian learning is this idea that neurons that fire together wire together. If you have two neurons, they're going to be labeled the pre and postsynaptic neuron, and I'm going to draw little triangles here. We've got our pre and our post. And the presynaptic neuron is going to send out an axon that's going to go close to the postsynaptic neuron, and the postsynaptic neuron has a dendrite, and where they get close together, they might form a synapse. And the idea behind Hebbian learning is that there's a mechanism here in the synaptic area that tries to detect if the presynaptic neuron's activity causes the postsynaptic neuron to activate. So we're looking for correlations where the presynapse activates and then the postsynapse activates. And if it detects that correlation, then it strengthens the synapse so that that correlation actually becomes a causation. All right, so now let's move on to Hopfield networks. So Mr. Hopfield is a person, and he invented something called a Hopfield network. So a Hopfield network is a type of artificial neural network. We've got a bunch of point neurons, and I'm just going to draw a big cluster of point neurons. And these point neurons are connected to each other, either all-to-all or randomly. It doesn't really matter. There's a bunch of connections here, and we're trying to determine the synaptic weights of these connections. These connections are all weighted. It's an artificial neural network. These are like perceptron or sigmoid activations functions, and we take the sum of the inputs. You know how these things work. But it's recurrent, so this whole thing is actually run by a bunch of differential equations that you integrate over time. And these weights are bidirectional. Because it is a very simple model here. This was invented way back in I'm not sure when it was, but a long time ago. So what happens when you have all these things connected and you let learning loose on it, then you get patterns that form where neurons that activate together strengthen the connection between them. And then you get a pattern where these neurons that are coactive are always coactive, and they form a very strong connection. And what will happen over time is you'll get a clique of neurons that are all coactive at the same time, and they all have connections between them. And whenever like half of the neurons in this group activate for whatever reasons, the other half are going to activate as well. This becomes a stable pattern of activity. This is what they call an attractor. In the literature, this is known as an attractor state. So in the literature, Hopfield networks have attractor states, and they have a bunch of different attractor states where there's different, cliques of neurons that are all wired to each other. Another thing that I don't think I mentioned yet is that there is usually an input to the network with sensory input. So you'll have like an image that you're feeding into the network, and it just this becomes another synaptic connection because the inputs become synaptic connections. And the interesting thing about these networks is if you take your input and you mask off half of it, you remove half the image, then the neurons here, many of them fail to activate in response to the input that they've associated with. But because they have all these recurrent connections, the whole clique of neurons activates, and it pattern completes, I think is the term they use. It's a pattern completion mechanism, where you have some pattern in the input that was only partially recognized, but through that partial recognition, we were able to recover the complete internal representation of what we think is there. Another interesting thing you can show about Hopfield networks is that if there's enough neurons in them and you structure it correctly, you can have these clicks overlap, where there'll be, a click here, but some of the neurons are in multiple clicks. Attractor states. And they can overlap as long as the overlap is relatively small. And if there was a large overlap between the attractor states, then there would be a problem, because one attractor state activating would cause other attractor states to also activate. All right, so now let's add some more details to our conception of a neural network. So, starting from our Hopfield network, let's talk about inhibitory neurons and how they might fit into our Hopfield network. So, with just the Hopfield network, we have only one type of neuron. But in the real brain, we have two types of neurons. We have many types, but broadly speaking, there are excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons. Excitatory neurons make other neurons that they connect to more likely to fire. They excite the things that they target. Meanwhile, inhibitory neurons make everything turn off. They inhibit the activity of neurons. They inhibit the action potentials. So neurons only emit one type of neurotransmitter each, and so there's two types here. So in our circuit, this is what it's going to look like. We're going to have our inputs that connect to the excitatory neurons, and the excitatory neurons are all connected to each other as well. And this is our Hopfield network right here. The inputs cause the excitatory neurons to activate. The excitatory neurons then form pattern. They do pattern attractor states. That's what they call it. They have attractor states where they all activate together. They reinforce those patterns. The inputs are reinforced to those patterns as well. But then we have the inhibitory neurons that turn everything off. And the inhibitory neurons are connected to the inputs and the excitatory neurons as well. So in order to really understand how powerful this system is, let's look at how it works as a sequence of events in operation. You have the system will initially be silent. There will be no activity in the area of the cortex. And then some input will be presented, and a bunch of synaptic activations will happen on the inputs, and it will activate the excitatory neurons, but it takes multiple synaptic inputs to make a neuron activate. So these things have to build up, they have to acquire multiple synaptic inputs. And these inputs don't happen all at once. Only the strongest inputs happen quickly, and then there's sort of a long tail of nerve endings going off to bring those inputs into the brain. This is an ongoing process of acquiring inputs, and they accumulate on the excitatory neuron. They slowly raise the voltage of the neuron until the neuron emits that action potential. So these neurons activate slowly over time. And meanwhile, the inhibitory neurons are also collecting input slowly over time from the real inputs, but also they're collecting inputs from the excitatory neurons that they're connected to here as well. So what you end up with is a race. The excitatory neurons that activate quickly, then they activate. They reinforce all of the things, all of the connections that caused them to activate. They lock on to the inputs that activated them, and they lock on to the other excitatory neurons that activated in close proximity to them in time as well. And you see the formation of these attractor states. But once the attractor state reaches some critical size, some critical number of action potentials emitted as part of that attractor state, it starts to get the inhibitory neurons to activate as a result, because more excitatory neurons are going to cause more inhibition. They're going to as you get more activations in the excitatory patterns, it activates the inhibition, and the inhibition then goes back and targets those patterns. Broadly speaking, the inhibition touches everything. The inhibitory neurons, they're connected to the real inputs, so eventually they will activate regardless of what the excitatory neurons do. And the inhibitory inputs are connected very broadly across the excitatory networks. They're designed to shut everything down. So what is this doing? It's a race to activate, and the criterion to activate is how many inputs it received, which means that this is a sorting algorithm. This is sorting excitatory neurons according to how many inputs they acquired, how many inputs they successfully matched with their synapses. And only the excitatory neurons with the most synaptic support activate. And then you see, once a few of them have activated, you see once a few of them have activated, you see the whole clique of them activate, where they're all connected to each other and they are all part of a stable attractor state. You see that activate, and once that activates, other regions of the brain can reliably recognize that pattern, as opposed to a partial activation, which can't necessarily be recognized by the rest of the brain. But here's the thing, if the rest of the brain can recognize that that specific pattern has happened, then so can the inhibitory neurons. And the inhibitory neurons are not just broadly inhibiting all the excitatory neurons. I mean, they are. But also they form additional connections that are learned. So you could have an inhibitory neuron that learns a specific pattern from the excitatory neurons. So not just all the excitatory neurons connected to it, but no, like a very specific pattern of them could trigger this inhibitory neuron, and it could then inhibit just the neurons that caused it. And the spike timing dependent plasticity rules support this happening. This will spontaneously emerge given the right base connectivity patterns and spike timing dependent plasticity rules. And what's more, I should probably mention that there are multiple inhibitory neurons that are all doing the exact same thing. So it doesn't just spontaneously emerge. An identical pattern emerges in a group of inhibitory neurons where they're all detecting the same pattern, and they're all going out and inhibiting the same pattern. And now you don't just have a little bit of inhibition, you've got like a bunch of inhibitory cells that are all inhibiting this pattern, so that pattern is going to get shut down very strongly. But it's okay because it's already been detected very strongly. It's been detected by the inhibitory neurons and presumably the rest of the brain as well. And now that it's been inhibited, the network is silent, which means that other things can be detected. Other patterns. The input might contain multiple things happening that you want to detect, that the brain is going to detect. And by inhibiting the specific patterns that happened, you don't interfere with the other patterns competing to activate. You didn't just shut the whole thing off. You only shut off the very specific result that you detected and then acknowledged and then turned off because it's been received. So this is just the basic excitatory-inhibitory circuit that happens throughout the whole cortex. If you just take a bunch of excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons and you put them in a petri dish and you put a bunch of electrodes on the bottom of the petri dish, those are the inputs, and you do stuff with it, you'll start to see this kind of circuit start to form. All right, so I think that's about it for today. I hope you've learned something interesting, and until next time, meow.